They mocked his skin, questioned his presence, and stripped him of dignity before he spoke a word. Called him out, called him a fraud, told him people like him don't walk through executive doors. They laughed at his silence, mistook it for weakness, and paraded their authority while dragging him through procedures meant to break him. But the building they tried to bury him in? It was already his. This isn't just another story of discrimination. This is a surgical takedown of everything they thought untouchable. You're about to witness how arrogance collapses, not with a shout, but with a signature. Watch closely, because the moment they forced him to stand beside a copy machine like a criminal was the moment they signed their own fall. Let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe if you're tired of surface-level justice, and drop a comment. At what point would you have snapped? The automatic glass doors parted with a mechanical hush, spilling a gust of cold air into the marbled lobby of Rutherford First National. Othniel Boone stepped inside, adjusting the cuffs of his muted gray dress shirt beneath a tailored blazer. The space was a shrine to corporate excess. Brushed gold finishes, obsidian tile, the gentle clink of glass water tumblers on brass trays. Soft jazz curled in from hidden ceiling speakers, and the perfume of affluence lingered in every breath. But it was the silence that struck him first. Not the absence of sound, but of recognition. He stepped forward toward the gleaming reception desk. The woman behind it, with tight hair in a French twist and a silk scarf knotted at her throat, didn't look up. Her eyes stayed locked on her monitor, fingers flicking her mouse with bored precision. When he reached the desk and cleared his throat gently, she didn't ask his name, didn't greet him, just raised one manicured hand and flicked it once to the side, a motion that said more than any sentence could. It wasn't direction, it was dismissal. Othniel's mouth tightened imperceptibly. He opened his leather folio, withdrawing a printed appointment confirmation and his identification. He placed them neatly in front of her. Still no glance. Instead, she pressed a button beneath the counter. Seconds later, a security guard emerged from a side hallway. Not rushing, just appearing. The man's eyes swept over Othniel's frame as if scanning for weapons, drugs, or the absurdity of presence. The guard didn't speak to the receptionist, didn't ask Othniel a question. He simply stepped forward, blocking the path beyond the desk, and nodded toward a separate hallway. That's for private account clients only, sir. You'll want to use the retail access corridor. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried across the lobby, drawing subtle glances. A woman in pearls raised an eyebrow. A man in a three-piece suit looked down at his phone and smirked. Othniel didn't move. Instead, he calmly gestured to the folder still on the reception counter, now slightly ignored and beginning to curl at the corners. His voice was smooth but grounded. I'm expected. I have a meeting at 10 o'clock in Suite 4E. The guard shook his head as if the words didn't translate. The receptionist finally deigned to glance over. Her eyes flicked down, skimmed the paper, then back up without interest. That's VIP corporate access. She emphasized the word as if Othniel had never heard it before. We don't send independent walk-ins through that corridor. He's not a walk-in, came a voice from behind them. Another client, tall, older, white-haired, glided toward the counter and greeted the receptionist by name. She laughed softly, a different laugh than anything she'd offered Othniel. She reached for a bottle of sparkling water beneath the desk and offered it to the man before guiding him, personally, through the frosted doors to the executive suite hallway. Othniel was still standing there, unmoving. The guard's posture tensed slightly. You're going to need to step aside. Othniel, without raising his voice, repeated, I have an appointment with Regional Vice President Hughes. I'm not early. I'm not late. I'm not mistaken. He did not need to say the next part aloud. You are. But the message hung there, invisible and weightless, yet somehow heavier than stone. The receptionist blinked. Something about that name caught. The guard's shoulders squared. A pause rippled through the tension. Wait here, the woman said curtly. She disappeared down a hallway, without another glance. The guard didn't move. Othniel stood still. He had stood still before, on sidewalks waiting for cabs that didn't stop, in galleries where no one handed him brochures, in country clubs where someone always asked which car he valeted. This was no different, except this time he had earned this room. He didn't need permission to stand where he was already qualified to be. After several minutes, the receptionist returned, her face a war between discomfort and annoyance. "You can follow me," she said without eye contact. The guard stepped aside. Othniel walked forward slowly, each step echoing with a clarity the building could not ignore. Not rage, not pride, precision. The kind learned not from textbooks or speeches, but from decades of knowing you'd always be questioned no matter how quietly you carried your power. The junior associate who had awkwardly mistaken him for an inheritance claimant had vanished down the corridor, leaving Othniel with nothing but the ticking sound of a polished grandfather clock and the quiet rustle of velvet drapes brushing against air vents. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then footsteps returned. Not one set, but several. 2 women, 1 man, all dressed in identical gray slacks and company-issued navy cardigans, entered the room as if they had arrived on cue. One of the women held a clipboard. The man held a cup of coffee he clearly wasn't offering. The third, a redhead with narrow eyes, trailed behind, her heels tapping with faint amusement. The man with the coffee offered a tight-lipped smile that never reached his eyes. "Mind if we take a look?" he asked, gesturing to the folio even though he'd already reached for it. Othniel handed it over, not because he needed to, but because they needed him to. They flipped through the documents like they were reading a fantasy manuscript, pausing at logos, frowning at letterheads, squinting at numerical values as if the zeros were lies. The woman with the clipboard laughed softly, nudging the redhead beside her. "You're kidding," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for Othniel to hear. "This has to be a joke. These types of numbers." Her tone dripped with skepticism and sugar. The redhead didn't respond immediately, but raised an eyebrow. Then, with a theatrical whisper that wasn't really a whisper at all, she added, "He looks like he just stepped out of processing. Like, what is this rehabilitation outreach?" They all chuckled. Small, tight laughs. Controlled. Practiced. Not because the joke was funny, but because the target was safely seated, safely silent. Othniel said nothing. His spine straightened fraction, but his face remained calm. He had heard worse. From wealthier mouths. In more expensive suits. One of the women asked if the identification could possibly be fabricated. "The quality is high," she said thoughtfully, like she was complimenting counterfeit art. "But that address, it's south of Roosevelt, right?" She said the street like it tasted bad. The man took another look, muttered something about internal security cross-checks, and excused himself with the folio still in hand. The redhead remained, arms crossed, gaze fixed squarely on Othniel with the kind of disdain reserved for people mistakenly allowed into country clubs. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. Her stare spoke volumes. "You don't belong here." It was then that another staff member entered, this one pushing a maintenance cart stocked with glass spray bottles and paper towels. She was older, her uniform wrinkled, her expression indifferent. She moved with purpose but lacked grace, and as she passed close to where Othniel sat, she suddenly shifted her wrist. A splash of fluid arced from her bottle, catching the toe of his right shoe, a gleaming Oxford that now bore a dark, wet mark. The room stilled for a moment. The woman didn't apologize. She looked down, smirked slightly, then shrugged. "Should be fine. That kind of leather holds up better than you'd think," she said, her voice casual but layered. Then added almost thoughtfully, "Besides, dark shoes are made for darker days." Othniel glanced at his shoe, then at her. His expression remained unreadable, but the words clung to the air like cigarette smoke. Another chuckle from behind the desk followed. Someone had overheard. More mirth, less restraint. It became a scene without needing to escalate. The black man with the stained shoe, the amused staff, the executive floor indifferent to dignity. He dabbed the spot once with a cloth from his pocket, slow and precise, the way someone touches a grave. Not because it mattered, but because someone had tried to make it matter. The receptionist from earlier reappeared briefly, peering in through the door, saw him still there, and rolled her eyes before vanishing again. Eventually, the junior associate returned, holding the folder with both hands this time, and a cautious look on his face. Mr. Boone? Apologies for the wait. Mr. Hughes is unavailable, but he's asked me to relay instructions regarding your request." Othniel nodded, slowly standing. His frame unfolded from the chair with quiet strength. The others took a step back, not consciously, not collectively, but instinctively, like animals unsure of what had just shifted. The junior associate cleared his throat and continued. "We'll need to delay the wire until we conduct a full origin of funds review. Standard compliance procedure, of course. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. The most personal phrase in corporate vocabulary. Othniel asked, flatly, how long such reviews typically took. The answer was vague, vaguely indefinite, vaguely evasive. "We appreciate your cooperation," they said. "Thank you for your patience," they added. He said nothing in response, because at that moment there was nothing left to say. He sat in the same leather chair, near the low glass table stacked with magazines no one read, waiting, once again, as instructed. His patience had long shifted from virtue to armor. Across the room, a boy no older than 7 skipped through the corridor, his pressed khaki shorts and designer sneakers pristine. Behind him, a woman followed closely, a nanny by appearance, dressed in monochrome with a clipped walk and a leather handbag large enough to carry the child himself. The boy paused near the espresso bar, frowned, and turned toward the lounge where Othniel sat. Moments later, the branch manager entered. Othniel recognized him from industry panels. A man named Sterling Raleigh, with silvering temples and a voice that had once been described in a profile piece as disarmingly human. Raleigh crossed the room with a speed that was polite but rehearsed, his eyes darting not to greet Othniel, but to address the nanny. He murmured something and then turned to Othniel, a faint smile already plastered on his face. "Mr. Boone, I hope our hospitality has been acceptable," he said, though his tone held the stiffness of someone regretting formality. Before Othniel could answer, Raleigh's smile widened slightly, and he gestured to the boy who now hovered near the armrest beside him. "Would you mind terribly allowing young Cooper here to rest in that seat? He's been quite fidgety." The request came with the weight of command disguised as charm. Othniel looked at the boy, then at the cluster of empty chairs just feet away. Raleigh followed his gaze. "We like to keep our younger clients near the hospitality counter," he added, as if that explained why a grown man in a tailored suit should give up his seat for a child who had no idea what yield curves or liquidity meant. The boy stared at Othniel with a kind of bland expectation, as though this moment, of being offered something not his, was completely ordinary. The nanny stood behind him with a slight nod of approval, not quite meeting Othniel's eyes. Without a word, Othniel rose. His body obeyed before his pride could argue. The child clambered into the seat and immediately pulled a tablet from his miniature backpack, propping his feet where Othniel's briefcase had rested. The manager gave a tight chuckle. "These new generations, completely digital, aren't they?" he said. Then, with a pat on Othniel's shoulder that felt more like a dismissal than encouragement, he added, "Hang tight. Someone from compliance will be with you shortly." And with that, he disappeared into the same hallway he had emerged from, his voice already engaged in another conversation before the door even clicked shut. Othniel relocated to a smaller chair, wedged between a faux plant and the copy machine. It didn't matter. He had stopped expecting courtesy. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Another man arrived, younger than Raleigh, wearing an employee badge that read Greg S. He approached with a folder and a paper form, the kind printed in triplicate, white, yellow, and pink. "We need to verify your signature on a few items," Greg said. "Standard protocol." These came from the central office. He placed a packet in Othniel's lap and offered a pen with the kind of forced cheer reserved for kindergarten classrooms. Othniel nodded once, took the pen, and began filling the form line by line. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, curved over the boxes. The questions were invasive: source of funds, nature of transaction, professional affiliations, citizenship declaration. He completed them without hesitation. When he handed it back, Greg barely skimmed the surface before narrowing his eyes and pointing at one section. "You missed this field," he said, tapping the paper. Othniel frowned. "That section was left blank intentionally. It doesn't apply." Greg shook his head. "We need every field filled." Othniel took the paper back, added "not applicable," and returned it. Greg nodded, but didn't walk away. Instead, he lingered, squinting at the signature. "Actually, can I just ask, did you read this entire form?" The question hung in the air with a weight that didn't come from policy. Othniel blinked once. "Yes." Greg tilted his head, almost as if he were genuinely curious. "Okay, just checking. Sometimes these things trip people up." Then he laughed softly. "I mean, there's some big words in here. Even I have to reread it sometimes." He looked at Othniel again. "You're good with forms?" It wasn't a compliment. It was a test. Othniel said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than Greg's attempt at casual superiority. "No offense, of course," Greg added quickly. "I'm just saying, some of our clients struggle with these, especially when the documentation isn't part of their usual routine." He tapped the clipboard again and walked off, whistling faintly. Moments later, the redhead from earlier passed by with a printer tray in hand. She paused beside Othniel, looked down at the paper, then laughed without context. "He filled out the wrong version," she said, pointing. "That's the small business merchant account form. He should have had the high-tier executive clearance packet." It was simply absorbed into the rhythm of bureaucracy, a flaw never admitted, because to do so would be to cede power. Othniel leaned back slightly in the narrow chair, his composure as tightly controlled as ever. He had been here for over 40 minutes now, twice the duration of his scheduled appointment, and still no transaction had been initiated. He asked calmly to speak with a financial advisor, as originally planned. Greg nodded and disappeared. Minutes passed. Then another name appeared on a new badge. This man wore a tailored vest and wire-rimmed glasses. He introduced himself as Wallace Brandt, Senior Portfolio Consultant. "Let's take you into my office," he said, gesturing toward a hallway flanked with glass-walled rooms and discreet lighting. Othniel followed. Wallace's office was clinical in design. White shelves, 2 black armchairs, and a glass desk with a single monitor humming quietly. Once seated, Wallace opened the meeting by requesting confirmation of the account number. Othniel recited it from memory. Wallace typed it into his terminal, then paused. The screen blinked. His brows furrowed slightly, then reset into a smooth expression of practiced neutrality. "That's interesting," he murmured, not looking at Othniel. "The name of the entity attached to this account, it's..." He trailed off. "Unusual," he finished. Othniel waited unblinking. "Luxembourg Equity Holdings," Wallace read aloud. "It sounds like a European trust, but the records we have list you as the primary signatory." Othniel nodded. Wallace stared at the monitor, lips pursed. "Forgive a question," he said, voice taking on a sharper tone beneath the surface, "but this structure, it doesn't quite match the profile of someone listed with your profile." He hesitated. There could be some kind of back-end error. Othniel leaned forward slightly. "My name, my credentials, my controlling interest." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Wallace cleared his throat, glanced back at the screen, then opened a side panel. "I'm going to cross-reference your SSN with our legal records. Sometimes third-party entries don't properly reflect beneficial ownership, especially if the accounts were migrated from offshore." The implication wasn't subtle. Wallace was suggesting Othniel's identity might be fraudulent, or worse, stolen. He typed for another moment, then frowned. "I'll have to verify this with compliance," he said. The name Luxembourg combined with a flagged jurisdiction. "Well, we've had incidents of fictitious shells being used for laundering." He said the word laundering so casually, as if it floated free of any accusation, while still implying criminality. Othniel remained composed, his hands resting flat on the desk. Wallace studied him for another few seconds, then continued. "Also, I must say, the use of this particular firm structure, it's rare, especially for clients without European residency." Othniel replied that he held dual citizenship. Wallace raised an eyebrow. Dual? Interesting. May I ask how that came to be? Othniel gave him a brief summary. Wallace nodded, slowly, then offered a stiff smile. Well, the world is changing, isn't it? He said, as if it explained something. Then, suddenly, Wallace tilted his head and added, Have you been in contact with our International Branch Services team? Or perhaps immigration assistance? Sometimes, for clients with more complicated backgrounds, they're better equipped to guide the onboarding process. The room went silent for a moment, save for the hum of the monitor. Othniel said nothing, but his gaze sharpened. It's just, Wallace continued, we've had cases before where applicants attempted to pose as owners of foreign accounts, and it turned out to be optimistic misunderstandings. Perhaps someone told you the account was in your name. Othniel didn't blink, didn't move. His voice remained level. No misunderstanding. Wallace exhaled lightly, then turned toward the monitor again. Still, it might be best if you met with someone from our advisory panel. I'll schedule a review with our compliance attorney. He clicked a few keys, then glanced back at Othniel. In the meantime, I suggest we pause any fund movement, just until we can confirm identity beyond preliminary checks. Nothing personal, of course. That phrase again, always the cloak over the knife. Wallace stood, indicating the meeting was done. Othniel rose as well, his movements deliberate. He walked back down the hallway, past the other glass rooms where clients were being offered coffee and smiles, and re-entered the waiting lounge. The boy from earlier was gone. The receptionist didn't look up. Someone behind the counter whispered something as he passed. It didn't matter. He had seen enough. Now he was being escalated to compliance, which in this institution translated to containment. A waiting area had been prepared for him on the eastern side of the building, less luxurious than the VIP lounge, more exposed, more symbolic. The hallway leading there passed directly through the main lobby, and every step he took was visible to dozens of clients seated in marble booths or standing in sleek lines behind velvet ropes. A few heads turned. A few eyes followed him. None of it was accidental. 2 guards were already waiting when he reached the area. They weren't aggressive. They weren't rude. They were simply present. They introduced themselves as part of the internal risk review team and asked if he would submit to a brief screening. Just a precaution, one said. Standard when there's a mismatch in client records. Othniel remained composed. He nodded. He always did. Could you please remove your belt and shoes, sir? The words dropped casually, as if they were asking him to sign a birthday card. He glanced around. They weren't in a private screening room. They were in the center of a lobby, right beside the glass security checkpoint, across from the teller rows, and in full view of the mezzanine, where clients enjoyed lattes while watching the morning markets on mounted screens. Othniel's hand paused at his belt. He looked the man in the eye. There was no misunderstanding. This wasn't about security. This was a message. Still, he complied. Slowly, methodically, he unbuckled the belt and slid it from the loops, then bent to remove his shoes, Italian black leather, the same pair stained by cleaning fluid just over an hour ago. A woman in a pearl necklace glanced over from the private wealth kiosk. Her brows furrowed, not with concern, but with the thin, cruel curiosity of someone witnessing a scene they hoped might validate their expectations. A child pulled on his mother's sleeve and pointed at Othniel. The mother hushed him without looking away. Othniel stood barefoot on cold tile. His belt dangled from one hand. The security officer passed a wand slowly across his torso, then his arms, then around the waistband of his trousers. No sound, no alert, no apology. All clear, the man said, as if he were proud of the absence of incident. Othniel retrieved his shoes and belt and began redressing in silence. It was at that moment that a woman in business attire, likely from the operations desk, passed close by. She didn't stop. She didn't smile. She merely tilted her head and said softly, "You all right? You look like you're not, all the way here." The words were quiet but sharp, deliberate. He turned toward her, slowly. She didn't flinch. "I just mean," she added, "your eyes. You been using anything today? Meds, maybe?" something prescription. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, cloaked in concern. She moved on before he could answer, as if she already knew the truth or didn't care what it was. Her words echoed in his ears as he tightened his belt. He wondered how many others had heard her. He wondered how many agreed. And then he realized it didn't matter. They had already decided what he was. No truth, no document, no asset could undo what they saw when they looked at him. He didn't belong. Not in their systems. Not in their portfolios. Not in their building. That's what this day had been about. Every delay, every smirk, every standard protocol. The decision had been made the moment he stepped through those doors. As he made his way to the designated compliance office, a glass-walled cubicle with 2 plastic chairs and no visible computer, he noticed how the path cleared just slightly ahead of him. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to signal that people were watching. He could feel their discomfort, not with the situation, but with him. They weren't disturbed by the fact that a black man in tailored clothes was being scanned like a criminal in the center of a financial institution. They were disturbed by the idea that he might refuse to leave, might refuse to submit, might claim to deserve more. The compliance officer was late. Of course. He sat in the bare room for another 20 minutes. The glass fogged slightly from the outside, turning onlookers into silhouettes. Inside, time stretched thin. At some point, someone offered him water. He declined. He didn't trust anything offered without dignity. When the officer finally arrived, she was young, polite, and visibly flustered. She apologized for the delay, claimed there had been confusion regarding the location of his file. It wasn't in our primary system, she explained. We had to search legacy records. She said it like it was a compliment, like he was lucky to be found at all. Then she asked the same questions Wallace had asked. Then a few more. Then a few more. Just to be sure, she said. We need clarity on the origin of this capital. They wanted the way out to be his idea. They wanted to wear him down until he accepted that this building, this bank, this system, had never been built for someone like him. As the compliance review dragged on, the officer stepped out, leaving Othniel alone in the sparse glass-walled room, visible to everyone passing by. Her absence stretched past 20 minutes. When she returned, she didn't sit. She brought someone with her, another man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the charcoal gray suit of Upper Internal Security. His badge wasn't on a lanyard, but clipped to his breast pocket, and his expression didn't pretend. He introduced himself flatly, then placed a new folder on the table. There's been a further development, he said. Given the structure of your account and the flags associated with the transactions logged this morning, we are initiating a hold on all executive access. That includes digital signatory power. The words hit like slow poison. Othniel stayed still, but the officer continued. We're going to need you to sign a temporary suspension form. It removes your access privileges until the inquiry concludes. Standard fraud mitigation procedure. He slid the paper forward, tapped the signature line. This protects the institution, and frankly, it protects you. If there's been any compromise, signing this will demonstrate good faith. Othniel stared at the paper. It wasn't a suspension. It was a removal. Signing it would mean surrendering his own authority, his own name, on his own holdings, his own company. His refusal came calmly but firmly. The officer didn't argue. He simply stepped back, tapped an earpiece, and said a code phrase that was clearly rehearsed. Within 2 minutes, 2 security guards entered the room. One stood behind Othniel, the other at the door. The officer cleared his throat. If you choose not to cooperate, we'll need to escort you to the holding corridor while we escalate this to our legal department. Othniel didn't resist. He rose, gathered his folder, and followed. They didn't place hands on him, but they positioned themselves tightly enough that the difference didn't matter. It was not an arrest, but it felt like one. They didn't take him to a conference room, not even back to the original reception lounge. Instead, they brought him to a narrow corridor near the employee workspace, where an empty chair stood beside an industrial copy machine. It was a transitional space, not meant for clients, not even for senior staff. It was where interns waited for instructions and where terminated employees packed their things. There, in that strip of nothingness, they told him to sit. One of the guards leaned down and lowered his voice. "You're not under any sort of detainment. You're just being held while we clarify the scope of the situation." Othniel didn't answer. He simply sat, the folder on his lap, the machine beside him groaning to life, as someone printed a thick packet of HR forms just a few feet away. Employees passed by. They didn't stop. They didn't speak. But they looked. Each glance was brief, but together they became a crowd. Not one person asked why he was there. No one offered him water. No one offered dignity. He waited beside that printer for 27 minutes. His phone was in his pocket, still untouched. The bank had not taken it, but they hadn't offered a charging station either. A passive power cut. At one point, someone dropped a stack of binders near his feet and muttered, "Could you move your leg?" as if he were staff in the way, not a client with over 8 figures in assets under the bank's control. Eventually, the same compliance officer returned, holding a thin manila envelope. "We're documenting the process now," she said, her tone dry. "I brought a written statement of your refusal to suspend access. You'll need to review it and acknowledge that the risk to the institution is being assumed by you personally. Failure to sign may further complicate legal review." Othniel opened the envelope. Inside were 3 typed pages of legal disclaimers and a 4th page titled Non-Cooperation Record Acknowledgement. At the bottom, a line waited for his signature. He read it all, twice, then placed it back in the envelope and returned it. "No," he said, and the word was quiet but final. The officer didn't push. She nodded curtly, turned, and walked away. Another 20 minutes passed. During that time, a junior teller approached the copier, glanced at him, then whispered to her colleague, "Is that the guy from the fraud case?" The other one shrugged. "Something with shell accounts, I think." Othniel heard them. He was meant to. He stayed still. The silence wasn't his submission. It was his focus. Because this wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was expropriation. What they wanted was control, not just of his money, but of the narrative. They wanted to say, "We caught something." The last anyone saw of him inside Rutherford First National was his back as he walked through the glass lobby, shoulders squared, shoes silent against marble. No escort, no goodbye, no answers, only departure. He exited without fury, without flourish, just purpose. A black limousine awaited him outside, parked illegally beneath a no standing sign, but no one dared question the driver who stood beside it. When Othniel reached the curb, the chauffeur opened the rear door, bowed slightly, and stepped aside. Othniel entered without hesitation. The door closed with a hush of power exercised in silence. Inside, the vehicle was still and cool, the air filled with a faint scent of bergamot and leather. He did not lean back or loosen his tie. He did not sigh. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number from memory, and waited. A click, a pause. Then, execute the fallback protocol. Transfer all positions. Full liquidation. Sweep the reserves. No delays. He didn't need to explain. The voice on the other end didn't ask questions. The call ended in 6 seconds. The limousine moved forward, as if it had simply waited for the signal to breathe. In the bank, the atmosphere remained ignorant. Staff returned to routine. Clients chatted over espresso. The 2 guards who had flanked Othniel earlier now stood at the side entrance, exchanging stories about a recent corporate training. But in the background, something shifted. The systems that had blinked lazily moments ago now pulsed with new alerts. In the executive server room, a technician frowned. His monitor showed a sequence of transactions, nothing illegal, but sudden, swift, seamless, unstoppable. The alert tagged it. Mass asset reallocation originating from Master Admin Console. The technician clicked on the thread, then another, and another. His face changed. On the 43rd floor, Sterling Rawley's office phone rang. He didn't answer. It rang again. He picked up on the 3rd call, clearly annoyed. The voice on the other end was not nervous, it was clinical. "Sir, Luxembourg Equity Holdings has just transferred 2.2 billion in assets out of our custody. The sweep hit both domestic and offshore reserves. Clearance codes were valid. The instruction was irreversible." Raleigh stood slowly. "That's impossible." But even as he said it, his mind began assembling what had happened. He had questioned the man's identity, denied his authority, blocked his access, tried to corner him. And yet, the codes worked. They weren't stolen. They weren't fake. They were executive tier, level 0 override, tied to internal governance privileges higher than his own. The kind of clearance held only by founders, not clients, not investors, owners. In the limousine, Othniel adjusted the cuffs of his sleeve and looked out the window. The city moved around him without noticing what had just occurred. Beneath the surface, millions of lines of code were obeying his orders, shifting holdings, collapsing account clusters, and redirecting fiduciary controls away from Rutherford's infrastructure. Inside the bank, an emergency meeting was called. Department heads flooded the boardroom. Names were whispered. Systems were audited. Phones buzzed with rising panic. Someone finally said it aloud. "He didn't come here to transfer funds. He came here to test us." The compliance officer who had handed him the envelope now stood near the wall, pale and silent, the weight of her assumptions crashing into her like a tide. She remembered every question she asked, every delay she justified, every time she called him Mr. Boone with that clipped, tight tone. But now, there was no longer a Mr. Boone in the system. The master file had been purged, not deleted, relocated, encrypted, out of reach. That afternoon, a quiet bulletin reached the internal dashboard of every regional executive. Subject line: High-level client withdrawal event LUX. The attached document showed timestamps, transaction IDs, and a red bar across the bottom reading finalized non-reversible. Meanwhile, Bloomberg published a breaking headline: 2.2 billion withdrawn from Rutherford First National in 37 minutes, major client liquidates entire portfolio. No names were listed. No confirmations were offered. But the implications were devastating. Analysts speculated. Investors pulled options. Stocks trembled. Inside the bank, no one spoke Othniel's name again. But everyone remembered his face. The face they had doubted. The face they had dismissed. The face they tried to erase from the building by dragging him to a hallway beside a copy machine. Outside, Othniel remained quiet. He did not celebrate. He did not call his lawyer. He simply gave one additional instruction: schedule the press release. Noon tomorrow. At first, they had told themselves it was a hostile client, then a cyber breach, then a clever shell operation. But with each line of internal review, every possibility collapsed until only one remained. The man they had detained, interrogated, and stripped of dignity less than 24 hours earlier was not only who he said he was more. At 8:31 a.m., a confidential memo hit the inboxes of the 10 most senior executives within Rutherford. It was not from legal. It was not from risk compliance. It was from the Corporate Liaison Division of Orion West Holdings, their largest stakeholder. The subject line was short: ownership disclosure. The body was shorter: effective immediately, Marcus Othniel Boone is to be recognized as Executive Chair of Orion West Holdings and lead trustee of its primary financial proxy arm, Luxembourg Equity. All institutional communication is to be routed through his office. Full operational control deferred pending further instruction. There were no salutations, no explanations, no appeals. The silence that followed was seismic. Othniel wasn't a client. He wasn't even just a wealthy investor. He was the man who owned the company that owned the bank. Not in name, in function, in percentage, in control. And the moment that truth hit, everything that had happened within those walls, every smirk, every delay, every slur, every procedural weapon, became not just shameful, but dangerous. They had insulted the throne while sitting in its courtroom. And it wasn't private anymore. By noon, a video surfaced, grainy but clear, captured by a hidden lens, perhaps from a sympathetic intern, or maybe a silent security feed. It showed Othniel standing beside the photocopier in the employee hallway, belt removed, folder in hand, surrounded by whispers and turned backs. A timestamp in the corner confirmed the moment. 20 minutes after he was removed from the executive lounge. No violence, no shouting, just a man forced to exist in a space beneath the station while the system around him pretended not to see him. The clip found its way online. No title, no caption, just 6 minutes of truth. It spread like fire. Comments erupted. News anchors speculated. Advocacy groups called for statements. Within 2 hours, the bank's corporate media account locked all replies. By the end of the day, Rutherford's stock had dropped 9%. A hashtag began trending. Hashtag the man at the printer. In every comment section, people asked the same question. How could a bank treat someone like that? The real question was simpler. How many had they treated like that who didn't have the power to answer back? Marcus didn't give interviews. He didn't tweet. He didn't speak to reporters. Instead, he released one single-page statement. The systems we build reflect the values we tolerate. When they fail, it is not the system's fault, but ours for believing it couldn't happen to us. Accountability is coming. Then came the internal purge. One by one, directors received notices of reassignment. Middle managers were placed on immediate leave. The head of compliance was removed. Sterling Raleigh resigned for personal reasons by midnight. Offices were emptied. Passwords revoked. Policies rewritten. But none of it was enough. The deeper damage was cultural, structural, psychological. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a revelation. And in that revelation, Marcus became more than a man. He became a mirror. Other institutions began to check their records. Clients revisited their own experiences. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Industry leaders issued vague statements about equity and reform. But the public didn't want apologies. They wanted transformation. Quietly, Luxembourg Equity announced a new division, designed not to punish banks, but to rebuild them, to reinvest in ethical compliance, inclusive governance, and algorithmic transparency. Orion West Holdings, under the signature authority of Marcus Boone, issued a formal directive to the Board of Governance. The memo was precise, legal in tone, but irreversible in consequence. The senior executive team, including Sterling Raleigh and 7 division heads, were terminated effective immediately. There were no exit interviews, no graceful transitions. Their corporate emails were locked before their assistants could process the news. Their names were quietly removed from the executive roster on the company's website. And the moment that happened, the markets reacted. Investors who once considered Rutherford a pillar of financial conservatism saw only instability. Trust dissolved into panic. In the span of 24 hours, the company's share price dropped 23%, wiping billions off its valuation. Major stakeholders pulled out of long-term bonds. Credit rating agencies issued watch lists. But it wasn't the money that stung most, it was the shame. Financial analysts didn't talk about liquidity. They talked about ethics. Business journals didn't cover quarterly trends. They replayed the video of Marcus being held beside a copy machine, stripped of basic dignity, while whispers swirled around him like flies. That image became the watermark of the scandal. Internally, an independent audit was launched. The third-party review firm, hired at the direct request of Luxembourg Equity, was given unrestricted access to all records, including employee communications. The findings were brutal. Dozens of flagged incidents surfaced, emails mocking clients based on appearance, discriminatory memos embedded in procedural language, system tags like extra check or manual verify disproportionately used for customers with non-European names. It was no longer about Marcus. It was about a culture, and that culture was now radioactive. The redhead who had joked about prison jumpsuits during Marcus's intake was suspended without pay before the audit even concluded. Her HR record showed 2 prior warnings for similar behavior, both ignored. This time, she didn't just lose her job. She was blacklisted from every major financial institution partnered with Orion West. The man who handed Marcus the wrong form and implied he couldn't read it was called into a conference room, handed a document titled Final Termination, and escorted out within 7 minutes. He tried to protest, tried to explain that he was just following tone, but no one listened. Because now, every sentence sounded like an excuse. The cleaning staff member who had spilled fluid on Marcus's shoes was dismissed quietly, but not without consequence. Her remarks had been recorded, and her file sent to legal for potential civil action under hostile conduct policy. No one was spared, not even the ones who had stood by in silence. One by one, security footage was reviewed. One by one, names were matched to smirks and shrugs and side-eyed glances. Those who didn't intervene were documented as part of systemic failure. Rutherford's internal HR department was gutted and replaced with a consulting unit focused on workplace equity and institutional bias. New protocols were written. Old ones were burned. Meanwhile, Marcus never returned to the bank physically. He didn't need to. His presence was felt in every change. His authority inked into every resignation letter, every deleted login, every locked drawer in the corner offices now vacated. But the consequences didn't end there. Regulatory bodies, pressured by public outrage and shareholder unrest, opened formal investigations. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission launched a probe. Multiple state attorney generals called for hearings. Former clients began to speak up, names that had been silent, too afraid or too small to make noise before, now found courage in Marcus's stand. What happened to him had become the permission they never received. The public watched with a mixture of awe and relief as a fortress of status crumbled from within, not because of riots, not because of lawsuits, but because the man they tried to push aside had the power not to fight them, but to expose them. And exposure, it turned out, was more dangerous than vengeance. The storm had passed, but the echoes remained. Not just in the headlines or quarterly reports or audit trails that stretched back for years, but in the people themselves, those who once wielded power with carelessness, those who mistook superiority for competence, and those who had silently participated in injustice through apathy. Rutherford First National no longer existed in the form it once did. The institution had been stripped not only of its leadership and assets, but of the very culture it used to disguise inequity as protocol. In its place rose a new entity, leaner, more transparent, and grounded in a code of ethics not written in legal jargon, but lived through structural reform. At the center of this shift was Marcus Boone, not parading victory, but guiding transformation. He had chosen not to dismantle the institution completely, even though he could have. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He rebuilt it from the inside out. But true change does not come from new policies alone. It requires reconciliation, and that meant facing the past. Weeks after the scandal, a small nonprofit in Southside Chicago hosted a local event on rebuilding trust in financial institutions. It wasn't televised. There were no media crews, just folding chairs, community leaders, and families who had lived with systemic neglect their entire lives. Among the panelists was a man few expected to see, Sterling Raleigh. He wasn't in a suit. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up, face bare of pride. He had aged in weeks. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room went quiet not from respect, but wariness. He didn't speak to defend himself. He spoke to admit failure. He detailed the layers of conditioning he had never questioned, the structures he had inherited without inspecting, and the harm that complacency had caused. "I thought I was just doing my job," he said, "but I see now how dangerous that mindset can be when power shields you from consequence." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not try to reframe the story. He simply said, "I was wrong. I was blind, and I'm trying now to listen." After the event, Raleigh stayed behind and helped stack shares. He wasn't paid. He wasn't promoted. He volunteered. Over the next months, he became a fixture in the nonprofit space, teaching financial literacy workshops in neighborhoods once redlined by the very bank he had helped lead, sitting with families and helping them decode credit reports, mortgage clauses, and the fear baked into fine print. He never asked to be seen as redeemed. He only asked to be useful. When the news of his work reached Marcus, it came not from a PR release or press contact, but from a young woman who attended one of the workshops and wrote a handwritten note to Luxembourg's headquarters. She described how a man who once sat behind a glass desk had now sat across from her grandmother in a folding chair, teaching her how to avoid predatory loan offers. Marcus read the letter in silence. Then he asked for Raleigh's name to be placed on a short list, not for reinstatement, but for something more meaningful: invitation. Not long after, Raleigh received a formal letter, not on bank stationery, but on the personal letterhead of Marcus Boone. It was short. It acknowledged the damage. It recognized the effort. And it invited him to participate in a new corporate culture initiative, one designed not just to retrain staff, but to deconstruct the internal narratives that made discrimination feel like procedure. At the opening session, Raleigh sat in the back row. He didn't speak. He took notes. He listened. And when Marcus entered the room, there was no dramatic moment, no grand gesture. Only a quiet nod exchanged between two men who now understood each other far more deeply than titles or transactions could define. They had occupied opposite ends of a system once built to elevate one and erase the other. But now they stood on equal ground, not because one had risen, but because the other had finally stepped down. Elsewhere, former employees who had once laughed behind glass walls or whispered behind folded papers found themselves seeking new paths. Some never recovered their careers. Some chose new ones. The redhead, whose remarks about Othniel had gone viral, disappeared from the financial sector entirely. Years later, her name appeared on a volunteer roster for a shelter supporting displaced workers. Another, once a smug junior associate, now worked in policy advocacy, trying to pass fair lending regulations on a state level. None of this reversed the past. None of it erased what had been done. But change, real change, rarely begins in grandeur. It begins in discomfort, in recognition, in the slow, unglamorous labor of becoming different. And Marcus understood that. That's why he didn't use his power to crush the people who wronged him. He used it to rebuild the ground beneath them, so they could choose to stand on something new or fall by their own refusal. He never forgot the sting of the hallway, the questions disguised as kindness, the cold touch of authority wielded by those too arrogant to imagine they could be wrong. But he also knew that justice without grace is simply vengeance with better press. And so, as he continued to lead, to build, to reshape not just a bank, but a blueprint for how institutions could work for people, not above them, he did so with clarity, but not bitterness. Because in the end, the most powerful thing he ever did wasn't the transfer of $2.2 billion. It was the quiet, deliberate act of proving that dignity denied does not vanish. It waits, it remembers, and one day it returns. And when it does, it doesn't just restore, it redefines. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next release. What part of this story shocked you the most? Was it the moment Marcus revealed who he truly was, or the quiet way he chose justice over revenge? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let us know. We love hearing from our global community.